You Were Never Only a Body, Conversations with Claude, JR's Heart Code, a narrative on quantum consciousness, physical manifestation, and the unbounded spirit. Before we begin, a small disclaimer. Everything in this narrative falls into one of three categories. It is either documented science, documented government research, or clearly marked speculation. The purpose here is not to tell you what to believe. The purpose is simply to place the evidence on the table and invite you to sit with it. Because there is something strange about the world we live in today. The most radical ideas about consciousness, ideas that bend the boundaries of what we think reality is, are not only being discussed by mystics, monks, or philosophers. They are being discussed in neuroscience laboratories, in quantum physics departments, and inside declassified documents from intelligence agencies. For centuries, mystical traditions spoke about consciousness as something fundamental to reality. For centuries, scientists dismissed those ideas as superstition. But over the last 100 years, something unusual happened. Science began discovering things that sounded strangely familiar. The mystics got there first. The scientists eventually caught up. And somewhere between those two worlds stands the modern human being, a conscious observer trying to understand what reality actually is. So if we want to explore consciousness seriously, we should begin not with spirituality, but with physics. Because physics tells us something that most people hear but rarely absorb. You are not solid. This is not philosophy. This is physics. Every atom in your body is approximately 99.99999% empty space. The electrons that surround the nucleus of each atom are not tiny particles orbiting like planets around a sun. They are probability distributions, clouds of possibility that describe where the electron might appear if measured. In other words, at the deepest level of physical reality, matter does not behave like tiny billiard balls bouncing around in empty space. It behaves like waves of possibility. One of the most famous experiments in all of science demonstrates this behavior. It is known as the double-slit experiment. When scientists fire individual particles, electrons or photons, toward a barrier with two narrow openings, something remarkable happens. Instead of passing through one slit or the other like a classical particle would, the particle behaves like a wave. It spreads out and passes through both openings simultaneously, until it is observed. The moment scientists measure which slit the particle goes through, the wave collapses. The particle suddenly behaves like a localized object. The act of observation changes the outcome. This strange phenomenon is not controversial within physics. It has been demonstrated thousands of times. The framework used to describe it, known as the Copenhagen interpretation, was developed by physicists Niels Bohr and Werner Heisenberg in the early 20th century. According to this interpretation, quantum systems exist in a state called superposition. Multiple possible outcomes exist simultaneously until measurement forces the system into a single state. But this raises a question that physics has never fully answered. If observation collapses probability into reality, what exactly counts as an observer? Physics can describe the mathematics of the collapse. It can describe how particles behave before and after measurement. But physics cannot yet explain the nature of consciousness itself. Why is there an experience happening at all? This question has been called the hard problem of consciousness. Neuroscience can measure brain activity with incredible precision. We can map neural circuits, observe electrical signals moving across the cortex, and measure the chemistry of thought. But none of that explains why those processes produce subjective experience. Why does red look red? Why does pain feel like pain? Why does awareness exist at all? The dominant explanation within modern science is that consciousness is an emergent property of brain activity. According to this view, the brain is a complex information processing machine. When enough neurons interact in sufficiently complex ways, consciousness arises as a byproduct. Your sense of being a self, the feeling of I, is an emergent illusion generated by neural computation. That explanation may be correct, but it leaves something unexplained. Why should any of that processing produce experience in the first place? Why does it feel like something to exist? The philosopher David Chalmers famously described this as the most important unsolved problem in science. And because of that unsolved problem, Some researchers have begun exploring more unusual ideas. One of the most well-known proposals comes from physicist Roger Penrose and anesthesiologist Stuart Hameroff. Their theory, called orchestrated objective reduction, often shortened to ORC-OR, suggests that consciousness may arise from quantum processes inside structures within neurons called microtubules. In this model, consciousness may not simply be generated by the brain the way a factory produces goods. Instead, the brain may function more like a receiver, a tuning device interacting with deeper layers of reality. If that idea is even partially correct, it changes the entire way we think about the human mind, because receivers can be tuned, and signals can exist independently of the device receiving them. To understand why that idea has gained attention, we need to explore another important aspect of human perception. Your brain is filtering reality. Right now, your senses are receiving enormous amounts of information: visual signals, sounds, textures, smells, internal bodily signals, all of it arriving simultaneously. Researchers estimate that the human sensory system receives roughly 11 million bits of information every second. Your conscious mind processes about 40 to 50 bits. That means over 99.99% of incoming information never reaches conscious awareness. Your brain is not showing you reality exactly as it is. It is constructing a simplified model of reality that allows you to function. This filtering process is essential for survival. Without it, the brain would be overwhelmed by sensory data. A neurotransmitter called GABA plays a major role in this filtering system. GABA acts as the brain's primary inhibitory signal, dampening neural activity and preventing runaway excitation. Without that inhibitory system, the brain becomes overloaded with signals. Now consider something interesting. What happens when the filter weakens? In 1954, the writer Aldous Huxley experimented with mescaline and described the experience in a small book called The Doors of Perception. Huxley proposed that the brain functions as a reducing valve for consciousness, narrowing perception to the small portion necessary for biological survival. Modern neuroscience has begun investigating similar ideas. Research led by neuroscientist Robin Carhart Harris at Imperial College London examined brain activity during psychedelic experiences. Using brain imaging techniques, his team discovered something unexpected. Instead of increasing brain activity, psychedelic compounds often reduce activity in a network called the default mode network. The default mode network is associated with self-referential thinking, the sense of identity and ego. When activity in that network decreases, people frequently report experiences of unity, interconnectedness, and dissolution of the boundary between self and environment. Mystical experiences appear to correlate with measurable changes in brain activity. Whether these experiences reveal deeper layers of reality or simply represent altered brain states remains an open question. But the consistency of these experiences across cultures and centuries is striking. And curiosity about consciousness has not been limited to academic research. During the Cold War, intelligence agencies explored unusual cognitive phenomena as potential tools. One of the most famous examples is the Gateway Process Report. In 1983, a U.S. Army analyst named Wayne McDonnell evaluated a training program developed by the Monroe Institute. The program used binaural sound technology called hemisync to influence brainwave activity and induce altered states of consciousness. The resulting report discussed ideas including holographic models of the universe and the possibility of non-local awareness. Around the same time, another government program known as Project Stargate investigated remote viewing, the claim that individuals could perceive distant locations without sensory input. For more than 2 decades, researchers at Stanford Research Institute and later Fort Meade conducted experiments exploring these possibilities. The program eventually ended after mixed results. Some experiments appeared to exceed statistical chance. Others did not. Interpretations remain contested. But the existence of the program itself demonstrates something important. The question of consciousness was taken seriously enough to investigate. Meanwhile, physics itself was revealing something even stranger about reality. Quantum entanglement demonstrates that particles that once interacted can remain connected across enormous distances. When one particle is measured, the state of the other changes instantly, regardless of how far apart they are. At the deepest levels of physics, the universe behaves less like a collection of separate objects and more like an interconnected system. Physicist David Bohm proposed a framework called the implicate order, suggesting that the visible world unfolds from a deeper unified field. In that view, matter and consciousness may both emerge from the same underlying structure of reality. Long before quantum mechanics existed, philosophical traditions around the world proposed something similar. Across cultures, mystics and contemplatives arrived at the conclusion that consciousness is not identical to the body. Hindu philosophy describes Brahman as universal consciousness and Atman as its individual expression. Buddhism describes the self as fluid and impermanent. Many indigenous traditions describe consciousness as something that extends beyond the individual body. Modern research into near-death experiences has documented similar reports. Some individuals revived from cardiac arrest describe vivid awareness occurring during periods when measurable brain activity is minimal. Interpretations remain debated, but one fact remains clear. Humanity does not yet understand consciousness. Physics reveals that matter is not as solid as it appears. Neuroscience reveals that perception is heavily filtered. The deeper nature of awareness remains an open mystery, and perhaps that mystery is not something to be feared. Perhaps it is something to explore. Because if consciousness is not merely a byproduct of neurons, if it is instead connected to deeper layers of reality, then the human being may be more than a biological machine. You may be something far more interesting. A temporary pattern in a much larger field of awareness. A wave rising briefly from an ocean that has always existed. This does not mean abandoning science. It means continuing the investigation with humility. The honest answer remains simple. We do not yet know what consciousness truly is, but the evidence suggests that the question itself may be far more profound than we once imagined. And the exploration of that question does not belong only to laboratories. It belongs to every conscious being willing to look inward and ask it. Because the most important instrument for studying consciousness has always been the human mind itself, and you are already holding it. Take care of yourself and take care of each other. It's not that hard. Marked by light, have no fear. The garden is near,